Normally, I now launch into the part of the presentation where I talk about strategies. So Trent and Miriam had a very modest nest egg. What strategies can we employ to make sure it's actually bigger? Well, for the last couple of years, I've very much felt like the prophet in her hometown standing up here, because so many of you know me really rather well. And so this year, I've imported a prophet from far, far away, New South Wales, to talk about the strategies that we employ in our super funds. So we've got Tracey, legend from the East. She used to run an accounting and superannuation advice practice very much like Zondergaard. And then a few years ago she changed, and now she provides advice to advisors such as myself. She is the co-owner of SMSF Design and the Strategy Hub. And she's come all the way from New South Wales to be our prophet tonight on the strategies. Please welcome Tracey.
From far, far, far away. Let me navigate this stage without falling over. Just so I know, because I don't know anyone in the room, how many of you actually have self-managed super funds? How many of you are thinking about setting up a self-managed super fund? Who's here just for the drinks and food that I'm keeping you from? Excellent, good job, good job. Speaking of drinks, I've noticed there's a couple of bottles of champagne at the back that you can win, and a bottle of red. Feel free to put Tracey Bester's, Tracey. I'm quite happy to take it back to Sydney with me. If you don't want to win it yourself, that's fine, by me. So let's talk about strategy. And what is strategy to do with self-managed super fund? So I want to go through 5 different key areas of your self-managed super fund strategy journey. But if you don't have a self-managed super fund right now, think of it in terms of your superannuation, because superannuation is more than just investment choices. Investment choices are really important because that's what's going to grow that nest egg, but we need to think about how do we protect it? How do we choose who makes decisions around what happens in our superannuation world? So let's talk about strategy and your super strategy journey, getting it right for you and your family. So let's jump into it, because I know I'm the last speaker, keeping you from food and drink. So we're talking about accumulating wealth. And the numbers that Gina shared with you, there's a huge benefit in terms of having money inside of superannuation concessionally taxed, isn't there? Versus having money outside of super. How many of you think the government will continue to change the rules around super? Yeah, I think you're pretty right. So we kind of just have to get over the fact that the government are going to change the rules, don't we? We just have to deal with it and keep thinking about the strategies moving forward. So what I want to work through are 5 key areas of strategy journey ideas and questions. So the first one is around control, and I'll explain what all of these mean in just a moment. Control is the first, protect is the second, grow is the third, provide is the fourth, and finally exit. Now you might think, why on earth would we be thinking about an exit strategy? Well, to me, if you haven't thought about how you're going to get out of something before you get into something, you might have, not thought through some of the ramifications. So we need to think about exit. Let's work on them. I'm going to ask you a number of questions, so feel free to write these down, but the slides will be made available to you anyway. So although we need to focus on growth, investment growth, let's focus on how to protect ourselves and our family and provide for our family. Who wants to provide for their family? You don't have to answer that question. They might be sitting next to you. No, we all want to provide and look after our families. Why are we putting all of this effort in if it's not for ourselves and our families at the end of the day? So how do we get the balance out of those two things? We get the balance out of the wealth creation and the protecting the family by focusing on the strategy and the strategy journey. Shall we work through each of them? Let's start. So the first one is around control. And control is really important. So for those of you who've set up a self-managed super fund, or those who might be thinking about setting up a self-managed super fund, you've probably thought of 2 things. You want more control over the decision making, and you want more choice that you can't have in your current superannuation environment. Is that accurate to say? Choice and control. Those are 2 reasons why people set up self-managed super funds. So when we're thinking about control and strategies for control, what would happen in your self-managed super fund if you could no longer make decisions? If you were incapacitated by dementia or some other disability that affected your decision-making capability, what happens to that control in a self-managed super fund world? Well, we have this strategy around who would you like to replace you? So in a self-managed super fund, you have to be the trustee and the member. So you're responsible for making decisions, which is one of the reasons people set up a self-managed super fund in the first place. But if you can't make those decisions, who are you going to entrust to make those decisions for you? And so we need to think about this question here, and this is one of the key strategies every SMSF needs to think about, every SMSF member needs to think about. Who would you like to replace you? And the reason I say replace you is because the superannuation legislation requires that if you are mentally incapacitated, you need to be replaced as a trustee within a certain time frame. So who is it that you would like to replace you? And that person needs to be your legal personal representative. Now, who is your legal personal representative when you're alive? It is your enduring power of attorney. So if you have a self-managed super fund currently and you do not have an enduring power of attorney, it's something you need to get sorted right away. Speak to Gina about that right away. Because if something were to happen to you, then you need to have the documentation in place. So who would you like to replace you in the event that you cannot make decisions, or in the event that you don't want to make decisions any longer? This same control mechanism and strategy applies. So if you want to go, who wants to go sailing around the world when they retire and not have to deal with a self-managed super fund anymore? Nobody wants to. I do. I'll go. So if you want to do that, then you could actually use this control strategy to have someone step into your shoes to replace you in terms of making those decisions. So that's the first part of control. How many of you have multiple variations of mobile phones? Yeah? Hopefully you don't have them all sitting in a drawer like Donald Trump's attorney with incriminating information on them. But the whole point about this with control is your game plan up to date? So from a strategy perspective, we need to make sure that our control documentation, our game plan is up to date. And what is our game plan? What am I talking about here? That is your trust deed. So how many of you have read your trust deed? Again, you don't have to answer that question. Oh, good, you have. Honest answers, that's good. If you haven't read your trust deed as a self-managed super fund trustee, probably a good idea that you actually do read it. I normally ask that question to accountants and they actually just don't look at me when I ask that question. Joking. But if your game plan is not up to date, if you're running on old rules, then you're not going to get the best out of your self-managed super fund. So make sure that strategy is up to date as well. If you've got individual trustees, really, think about having a corporate trustee as opposed to individual trustees, and talk to Gina about the reasons for that. Don't have time to go into that now. So control. Who's going to make decisions for you if you can't make decisions? And is your game plan up to date? Are we cool with those two? Two strategies to think about. Protect. So the second part of the SMSF strategy journey, and the reason it's the second part is because it's kind of one of the most important things from a self-managed super fund perspective. So the first part and the first question around strategies with Protect is, how do you want to protect yourself? So if you're self-employed, or if you're in an employed situation and you're injured and you cannot work, then how would you replace your income? And you might think, well, you might say to me, Trace, I've got income protection insurance. So that's cool, no problem at all. How do you then cover your income for the waiting period? How many of you have income protection insurance? How many of you have a waiting period? Okay, think about that. So if you were injured, think about the waiting period. How do you actually cover your income for the period of the waiting time before you actually get your income protection policy payout? If you can cover that yourself, great. If not, a self-managed super fund might be able to pay you a non-commutable temporary incapacity income stream for the period of that waiting period until you've actually got your income protection coming through. It's not quite as simple as that, but it certainly can be done in a self-managed super fund. What about the top-up? Does income protection pay 100% of your income? No, it doesn't. It pays generally 75%. Please don't answer this by putting your hand up, but how many of you only live off 75% of your income? If you're living off more than 75% of your income, then how do you cover that top up? Again, the self-managed super fund might be able to help with that top up from a non-commutable temporary incapacity income stream. So there's a lot of things that we can do with our self-managed super fund from a strategy perspective to help protect us. So how do you want to protect yourself? If you're self-employed and you can't get income protection insurance at all because of either you can't get covered or because the premiums are too expensive, then again, we need to think about potentially using our SMSF to help protect, because one of the ancillary benefits or ancillary purposes of a self-managed super fund is to be able to provide from a temporary incapacity perspective. So a couple of things to think about there. And of course, unfortunately, all of us are going to meet our demise one day. So the question there from a strategy perspective is, how do we want to protect our family? What do we want to leave to our family? How do we want to use our self-managed super fund to do that? Unfortunately, we can't just say, well, all of our SMSF can go wherever it wants to and all be tax-free. That is not the way it works. So we need to actually think about, well, how do we want our SMSF to provide for our family on our death? And in what capacity do we want that? How do we want to structure that? Is it a lump sum? Is it an income stream? Do we want to pay it, for many, many, many years, or do we just want to give it and run, kind of idea? How can we manage that process if we've got multiple children, if we're a blended family? There's a lot of considerations that come into play when we're thinking about structuring death benefits. So how do we want to protect our family? How do we want to look after our family? Really key strategy. And if you have, again, a self-managed super fund or thinking about setting a self-managed super fund up and you haven't revised your estate planning within the SMSF, it's something that you need to do. Because we've had so many changes from a super reforms perspective with estate planning and with the amount of money that we can have in pension phase and et cetera, that if we haven't revised our estate plan in a while, probably a good idea to do that. So think about the structure and the strategy around how to protect your family. So protect is number 2 on the list. The first one is control, the second is protect. Are we good so far? Good so far, excellent. The third strategy point is to grow. And obviously that's what we all want to do, don't we? We want to grow our money as much as we possibly can. But what's the strategy piece around this? And there's loads of them. There's something like 36 different strategies, by the way. I keep touching this, sorry. About 36 strategies that we can think about and work through from an SMSF perspective. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about all 36 tonight. So from a grow perspective, the question here is, what's your contribution strategy? And Gina was talking about it in her example. The strategy, the contribution strategy was that $9,500 every year was going to be contributed into the fund. But what's your contribution strategy? You see, there's a mix of contributions that you can make. You can make employer contributions, a superannuation guarantee. We can do some salary sacrifice. We can do our personal deductible contributions now, which Gina was talking about for those who are employed or even those who are not employed, can make a personal deductible contribution. And deductible just means from before tax money. You're going to claim a tax deduction on that. We can then make after-tax contributions, which are called non-concessional contributions. So what's our strategy to maximise those? And if you're not maximising those contribution caps every year, and you have the capacity to do so, you're probably not utilising the superannuation concessional environment as best you could. And of course now we have our over 65 downsizer contribution. I say downsizer because you don't actually have to downsize. You don't have to go to a smaller house. But you can make a contribution over 65 from the sale of your family home with a few conditions. So there's lots of contribution strategies we need to think about. This is a good time of year to actually start thinking about them. And for your information, anyone who hasn't made their contributions for this financial year, you've got one day to get that sorted. It's the 28th of June. Please make sure you get it done. So what's your contribution strategy? What about assets to transfer in? Do you have assets that we could potentially transfer into your self-managed super fund? Do you own listed securities in your own name? Do you own business premises in your own name or in a related entity that potentially could go into the self-managed super fund? It's a really powerful strategy when we can put commercial premises inside of a superannuation environment. Again, we'll be able to share some examples of work that she's done with clients on that. But what about assets to transfer in? If you've got assets sitting outside of super, should they be inside of super? Should they actually be inside of the self-managed super fund or a related entity of that self-managed super fund as opposed to your own name? We need to think about the strategy of growing the balance of the super fund by transferring assets in as well. So the growth strategies are not just about investment options, are they? They're about, well, how do we maximise those caps? And like I said, if you're not maximising your contribution caps, think about how that might work for you. Obviously, it's a cash flow consideration. We're not just doing this for tax reasons. So we've got to think about funding the cash flow of that. But if we have the capacity to do that, then it's really powerful to think what the benefits of those that strategy might be. And the fourth one is provide. So once we get a certain age, preservation age is met, and we met a condition of release, two things we have to do to get money out of the super fund if we're just looking at retirement benefits here. So we have to meet preservation age and we have to meet a condition of release. Once we've done that, we need to think about our strategy for providing benefits. How do we want this super fund to provide benefits to us? Do we want, or how much do we want, first of all? We have to take a minimum, but above the minimum we can take whatever we want. Do we want it as a pension? Do we want a lump sum? Do we want it every week? Do we want, just chunks of money whenever we want chunks of money? What's our strategy around pension planning? And again, the super reforms has meant that if you've got a pension in place, then there are some things that you might want to review with those pensions. Now, because we only can have $1.6 million, or start with $1.6 million in our retirement account, our pension account with the superannuation fund, we need to try and maximise that kind of cap of $1.6 million. So if you are taking a pension out of your self-managed super fund and you're taking more than the minimum pension, then you need to have a chat with Gina about restructuring that pension payment slightly, because you don't necessarily want to take more than the minimum from a strategy perspective as a pension payment. Take the minimum, and then anything over and above that you might want to consider as a lump sum payment as opposed to a minimum pension payment, because it will reduce your $1.6 million cap space. A little bit technical, but talk to Gina about that. If you have a pension, SMSF pension, you're taking more than the minimum now, make sure you definitely phone her and have a conversation for the next financial year about what your pension strategy should be. So think about pension strategy. How much is enough? Gina shared a slide on the $64,000 in terms of is that enough and what would that pension look like? So providing benefits is the whole purpose of having a superannuation fund, really, isn't it? That when we get to the point of retirement, we actually want that to replace our income that we've got going on right now. So we want to see that we can maximise those benefits as much as we possibly can. And on your death, do you actually have your spouse as a beneficiary of that pension? And do we make that so that it is automatically paid to your spouse? Or do we have a decision, or do we allow the trustees to make a decision at that point in time? So there's a number of strategy questions around pensions. And then finally, the final piece of the strategy puzzle, if you like, is exit planning. So let's just talk about exit planning for a couple of moments. How many of you have more than one child? Okay. So how many of you have thought about having your children in the SMSF at some point in time? Maybe you do, maybe you've just thought about it. How many of you think that your children will get along in terms of being able to make decisions if they're both in a self-managed super fund and you've gone? There's not many hands that time. No, that's fine. So would your kids actually get along? Would you actually be quite happy if you've got family in the super fund? Would you actually be quite happy to be in the super fund with your children-in-laws? There's some eyes getting raised, eyebrows going, oh, no, not really. So exit planning is important. What is the trigger for you guys that your SMSF might be wound up? And you've probably not thought about that, because when you start an SMSF, how many of you started an SMSF for life? Like, I'm in it for life. I've got this SMSF and I'm having it forever and a day. That's not necessarily the case. It's probably not the best case in some respects, because at some point you're not going to be around. And at some point, maybe your spouse doesn't want to have to manage it. And at some point, maybe you don't want your kids in the same SMSF as you, because who actually gets to control the decision making? That comes all the way back to The first strategies we talked about around control. And if it's going to become impossible to get decisions made in a self-managed super fund, then is it actually going to be practical, or is it just going to be a pain in the rear end, essentially? So what is the exit plan? At some point in time, as we get older, we might actually just decide that we don't want the hassle of an SMSF either. We might just say, you know what, it's all too hard. I just want to do what I want to do. I don't want to have to have that responsibility. So what's our exit plan? Well, we can wind up the SMSF, we can roll it out, we can take all of the money, we can go to the casino, we can, jokes, don't do that. We can appoint an external trustee and convert our self-managed super fund into a small APRA fund. There's a number of opportunities and ideas that we can have there, but you guys need to think about what the trigger point is going to be for you from an exit point of view. So the question there is, at what point am I going to want to exit the SMSF? And maybe that's death, but maybe you also want to think about the future of the SMSF in terms of your kids or their siblings, etc., in the same fund. And if you've got a blended family, I normally put up a photo of Rupert Murdoch and Jerry Hall with their family, and I say, how complicated would this SMSF be? If you've got a blended family, even more important to think about the exit planning. Because once the patriarch or matriarch of the blended family is no longer with us, then how often does everyone get on well with money? I mean, even think about your own family. I would hate to be in the same SMSF as my sisters, tell you that, just a nightmare. So exit planning is really important. So the 5 key areas: control, protect, grow, provide and exit are your 5 key trigger strategy points to make decisions. And once you've got the slides, think about those questions that we've raised. Talk to Gina about some of the opportunities and the different ways that you can structure the outcomes for those questions, but use the strategies as just as powerful as your investment choices, and your SMSF will provide for you for many, many years to come. That's it from me, nice and quick and short. I'm going to be at the back for questions afterwards, during the drinks and food as well. But let me hand back over to Charles.
Tracey, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Raises a lot of